everyone. This is Rick from MyWorkDrive. Let's just give this one more minute. We've got people coming in, so thank you all for being prompt. And we'll just give one more minute and see who we can get in when other people can join as they may. There it is. Okay. Thank you much for joining. We are extremely excited. This version 7.0 is available for production. It's been a long time coming. It is probably our most significant release in history. Very excited. And as always, we're customer driven, and almost everything you see here is because people have wanted it. So let's go. Okay, presenters for today. That's me in the middle. Dan Gordon, CEO, co-founder. Sorry, Dan, you should have gone first. And then Scott Biller, who is our VP of Engineering. Okay, here we are. Notice right here, 10-year anniversary. Very excited about that. Seems like only yesterday, but we've come a long way. Very, very happy with where we are. Significant growth. Just happy to be here. Have happy customers over that long haul. Here's a list of customers that we have. Significantly more. MyWorkDrive is very secure. The more secure you want to be, the better we look. So we have customers that are in verticals like healthcare, government, that are so secure, we can't even put them on the list here. They don't want to be there. So with these are the ones we have permissions. So we have enterprises, governments, higher education, healthcare, all significant verticals that we have. Okay. What are we going to do today? What is MyWorkDrive? I'm just going to, I should back up just a little bit. Q&A. Q&A, there's a section here. We'll answer everyone's question at the end. We'll be sure to leave time for that. And what we're going to do today is talk about MyWorkDrive. There are a fair amount of new people on the call that are prospects, not current customers, a lot of current customers. So we want to kind of do both. So I'm going to do the client side quick intro for the new people and maybe as a refresher for others. And then so I'll talk about this. I will do the client-side demo. Version 7 server demo will be by Scott, and Dan will pipe in as necessary. And then, as I mentioned, a Q&A at the end. So we'll be sure to answer everybody's questions.
One more housekeeping thing, Rick, is before you go on, we are recording this webinar, so those of you who are joining late, you won't miss anything. You can always pick up the recording that we'll publish at the end.
Thank you much. And also we can make this slide deck available because at the end there's a couple of links. We've done a very nice server setup admin guide because there's a lot of new things in version 7. So people may want to view that. So happy to distribute that after the call. Secure file share remote access. Instantly add cloud sharing capabilities, no VPN, no syncing, no migrating data. One thing I always say on calls is you don't have to migrate data. We access it where it is, which means no vendor lock-in, which is here. And we have incredible security and control. I think we have a compliance screen coming up, and we'll talk about why we have such good security and control. How do we access MyWorkDrive? We have 3 clients. We call the browser a client. There's no plugins, just a URL of the MyWorkDrive server, both from any browser. We have the mapped drive client for Windows, but we also have the equivalent for Mac. So we have both, and that's a light install on both. And mobile, we have a nice mobile app as well. You can choose to use a mobile app or just go in on the browser on the mobile. Okay, offline editing, Office online editing, no migration of files required. You can co-edit Office files, edit from the browser, from the map drive, from the mobile client. And we also have, we call it a single pane of glass, where you can see from the MyWorkDrive interface, OneDrive, SharePoint, And we have Office Online or only Office for those that don't have Office 365.
Right. We also have Office Online Server for local server. If
I
customers
got
don't want to do anything on the cloud at all, we do have some high security customers doing that where they're running their own Office Online Server on premise.
right, and I can't tell you who they are. MyWorkDrive compliance security features. Here, I don't need to read them all, but we have device approval, data leak prevention. We have external file folder sharing. And of course, we have Duo, ADFS, SAML, two-factor. And we'll talk about file blocking later as well on the MapDrive client. Okay,
Thanks,
I'm going to
Rick.
hand this over to Dan. Yep.
I'll take this couple next screens just to start with a network overview. This is, the way MyWorkDrive works is on the right, you'll see you have your servers, or actually in this case, storage. In the past, we've only supported SMB-based file shares or local storage. Starting at version 7, we also now support Azure file shares, Azure Blob, and in last year we added OneDrive and SharePoint. So you can actually connect MyWorkDrive to different types of storage. It can be mix and match depending on what your requirements are. Some customers, for example, might use local storage and then use OneDrive for home drives, but you can display that in the MyWorkDrive clients or in the web browser all in one interface, or they maybe even have some files up in, and now starting going into Azure Blob, but we support all of those. The MyWorkDrive server is in the middle, and then so that basically becomes the conduit into your storage. That's the thing on the left you'll notice is the client end clients. So those are the customers and clients that are then connecting to the MyWorkDrive server. So this could be a WAF firewall, it can be your load balancer, whatever you want to be, but there's nothing exposed to the internet for SMB or Active Directory, or no VPNs required. So that makes it more of a zero trust type of setup in this case. And notice that the clients can connect, like Rick said, mobile, desktop, and browser, but they can also edit documents in Office 365 as well. So Azure AD, Entra, and Azure Storage benefits, just quickly wanted to go over that. That's some of the stuff that we've added in version 7. So we're now supporting Azure AD native authentication. So we will continue to support Azure AD, Entra ID authentication with Active Directory mode as well. That hasn't changed. What has changed is if you don't want to run any Active Directory at all, you can use your native Entra ID and you don't have to do Active Directory. There are some changes in terms of what you can do with storage, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but we do support native Entra ID. We had a lot of customers that want to do a lift and shift type of scenario where they say, hey, we want to move our servers up to Azure. We don't want to be in the business of managing Active Directory. All our users are already in Office 365, but we don't necessarily want to pay the high costs of SharePoint for some of our files or even all of them. We want to just put them in Azure Files or Azure Blob. With our Entra ID authentication, you can now do that, right? And so you'll be able to just be able to support all those users and not have to manage any of that stuff going forward. The Azure File Shares API access also gives you the ability to connect through Azure APIs, whereas in the past we only supported connecting to SMB on Azure File Shares, which adds a lot of extra performance hits on that storage. So we find out that most customers ended up having to do the premium storage. They weren't satisfied with the speeds. With the Azure API, it's much faster, it's direct. We've even got some stuff built into our clients that allows some direct communication with the clients on upload as well. So therefore you can stick with the lower tier storage and still be able to effectively use the Azure file shares with that. There are some differences between Azure Blob and Azure file shares. So the Azure Blob, yes, it's API as well, but for those that are not familiar, Azure Blob also supports Data Lake Gen 2 with hierarchical namespace. And that's a lot of jargon, but the bottom line is it gives you the ability to be able to put permissions at the file and folder level on files using hierarchical namespace to the Entra ID users and groups. You cannot do that with Azure File Shares. Azure File Shares requires you to turn on SMB and join it to Active Directory to get that level of permissioning using NTFS style permissions. You can do share level permissions with Azure Files. So if you don't need to have that level of permissioning and you just want to do it based on at the share level, like marketing or sales or something like that, you can still go ahead and use Azure File Shares. So there's some decision points that you'll want to look through some of our charts to decide how you want to handle that if you're using Azure AD natively in Azure Storage. And again, here's some of the differences in terms of the Azure File Shares, in terms of what you can do. We also support, in addition to hierarchical namespace, there's a thing called Manage Identity. So if you have your virtual machine running in Azure, which is the preferred method anyway, you can actually have a thing called a Manage Identity. So in terms of Entra ID, that machine is known to Entra ID. And so when you're doing certain things like sharing files or providing access, you can do it in the context of the managed identity, which is the virtual machine in Entra ID, and it gives you more flexibility and gives you more capabilities. Even with Azure Files, you can do public file sharing then in that case that you wouldn't be able to do for certain storage methods with Azure Files. And we've got a big chart here. I'm just going to leave it here for a second. I'm not going to go through this line by line. All of this stuff is already covered in our server setup guide, but suffices to say, Active Directory versus Entra ID, there's definitely some decisions and changes that happen. Some of the more notable ones being the thing around NTFS permissioning. A lot of customers want to have that extra level of security that MyWorkDrive has always provided that other vendors don't provide. A lot of other vendors will just take your IDs and passwords and storage keys and stick it in their database and then always operate it, and you're trusting them for everything. Whereas with MyWorkDrive, in the past, you can, in addition, have the NTFS permissioning, and in the context of a user, it still provides that extra layer of security. So you can still do that with Entra ID, with Azure Blob Storage as well, but you can also use connection string if you want to do that also. So this will share this deck later, but again, this is already all covered in our server setup guide and our video over there too. And now I'm going to switch over to Rick, who's going to just go through the client and show how it works, the various clients, mobile, web, and browser.
Thank you, Dan. Hopefully everybody can see this. So what I'm going to do, the beauty of this is I'm pretty used to doing demos from the client perspective. Nothing's changed. Some speed improvements and functionality like that. But whether you're accessing it in the traditional way with Active Directory and NTFS permissions, it's going to act the way I'm going to show you. But if you're using version 7.0 functionality, same interface, which is very nice to know. So my job, I didn't have to learn a lot. The technical people did, but not so much me. So let's just jump right in. As I mentioned, there's 3 clients. So we're going to start with the web client. And again, I'm doing this for the new folks, but it may be a refresher for people that are current customers. And we hope to make this as part of our Anytime webinar in the future. So I'm going to log in. Notice here I get prompted here for login credentials. That's because I don't have two-factor or a single sign-on turned on. If I did, I would just flow right through. I have it turned off just so I can actually talk about this. So I'm going to log in. I should mention, this is totally customizable. You can white label this. Obviously, I'm doing it for the demo, but when I do customers' demos, I put their logo there so they can see how that works. And that flows through to all of the clients. This little window here, you can choose to turn it off. I have it turned on so I can talk about it. So here's DLP shares. It's saying, hey, there's some shares out here that have our data leak prevention on it. You can choose not to show that window. Again, I just do it as a talking point. So here's all the shares that I can see based on my permissioning into the storage. So here I've got something restricted. Here I've got my window into OneDrive and SharePoint. And here's a demo. Here's my demo share that I'll spend the most time on. And we also have guest sharing. Well, we have two kinds. We have external file folder sharing, and we have guest user sharing, which tends to be more granular, and that's leveraging Microsoft's B2B functionality. And the external file sharing is done with a link, a little more lightweight, but it's for those files that you want to share with people not in the organization, and just can send a link, and I'll show you how that works. So here's the list of, let me just highlight a document. Notice this is a notice it, well, that's DLP. Let me go to this one. And that case in point. Now, this is a dynamic ribbon. Well, when it was restricted, you didn't have download and upload and all those kind of things. So this is going to be dynamic based on the permissioning that user has. We have a built-in viewer for different types of files. But as we mentioned earlier in the slide deck, a real bread and butter is access your everyday files like Office type files. So if I double click on this document, there it goes. Here is the document that opens up in the Office 365 viewer. If I were to click on edit, and let's say all of us on the call had access, you'd see like 50 or 75 different toasts here of all the people that could do it. Not realistic, but you get it in an organization. I could be here, Dan could be here, Scott could be here, and we would be collaborating on the same document. Always remember with MyWorkDrive that we have the ability to you don't have to save anything back, right? Because it's all immediately done. That's how Office 365 works. So the user doesn't have to consciously put files back or say save this before I'm done. And we're always working on that. I call it the gold copy. We're not sync and share. We really chose not to be sync and share. You're accessing the document where it lives in the environment that you have. So if I close this document, you would see actually if we're in edit mode that it would say, hey, this document was locked. Now it's unlocked for editing by other people. So that's really the bread and butter, how things work. Now let's just take a look a little bit deeper. If I go here and I click on share, this is what I was talking about a minute ago on this external sharing, where I can say I want to allow downloads, I want 10 users or 10 openings max, expired after 3 days, and also put a password. If I did that and I created the link, I could just put that in an email and send that out. Now, can everybody do that? Only those that the admin says are allowed to do for shares that users and groups can do. So it's not like everybody can share. It's only that people really that should be doing the sharing. Another thing to talk about is you can open this in the local apps. So let's say I'm not an Office 365 user. I can open this in the local app, locally Office installed on my machine. Conversely, we have the same thing in the map drive. Let's say you want to use the map drive interface, but don't have Office locally on your particular machine. You can go and say, no, I want to use Office 365 to do that. Let's go here now and finish up with the web interface. Now here's my DLP functionality. Notice here, here's that market definition doc. You saw a minute ago when I double clicked on it, it opened up in Office 365. But because the admin has said, okay, I call it look but don't touch, the user can look but not touch the document. You can choose to put a watermark over it, and that's totally customizable. You can show it or not, but the nice part is, and they'll talk later about logging, everything going on in MyWorkDrive is logged. So in this case, you can say, okay, who tried to look at this file? Well, it's Rick, and it was viewed on this time. In essence, that's the highest level of DLP that we have. We can also make it so we can let people edit the document, but not save it locally. So there's different levels of DLP you could put on it. Just trying to think now, anything else I'd really like to talk about? I'll have the other two folks here make me honest before I leave here, but I think I've done pretty well on the web client. Anything I missed, guys? Oh, I didn't want to do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there, like you said, Rick. We have search built in there that you can use, the Windows search that comes into Windows servers. There's also DT search, was a third-party product that we plug into for that as well.
Yes. Yep.
Many other features.
Yeah. Really what we want to do here is I want to show you that for the new folks, happy to do a demo. We would certainly dive deeper, maybe with your custom files and stuff. Just a very high-level overview. Here we go real quick on the map drive. This is pre-MyWorkDrive, typical user machine, right? EC, easy. Okay, now let me start up that map drive client. And here we go. So you can start this up. It's very lightweight, by the way, and it can be a silent install if you like. And so this is the demo.wan path. That is the MyWorkDrive server. And then so here's my credentials. Now, again, if we're using single sign-on, we can flow right through. Sorry about that. I'm seeing a bunch of people coming in and admitting them. So map at startup, I can do. And so you wouldn't see this. I just do it this way so that you can see what's actually happening. So the client can automatically wake up when you boot up the machine. So let's do that.
And this is scriptable and everything else too, right?
Everything.
So for larger companies, you can push the client out, you can push out the startup, the URL, all of that's scriptable.
Right. Okay. So now, since I started that up, let's see what we get. Well, there's everything else we saw in the web client, right? A little less because I told in the admin panel, I don't want certain things available. Notice you don't see OneDrive and SharePoint because I chose not to view them in here. I could show all of that. Notice also that we've got DLP that we can show. We're the only ones that I know of that can actually do that. We can show restrictions through the map drive, just as you saw where you'd get the watermark and all of that. So let's just, how does this work? Exactly as you would expect a map drive to work. Here it is. Here's that file I opened up a minute ago. Here's the executive summary. Where is that? Here's the demo share. Let's go here. There's a copy. Okay. I can open it up here. And here it is. It's going to open up in the local copy of Word. And there's your chicken soup document. It's not a good copy, but you get the idea. So I can edit that and do everything. So from the user perspective, it's pretty cool. You can just, it's like a regular map drive, and they're not really even aware that's coming through something not locally on their machine. So we can do a bunch of neat things. You can also do things like this. That's not typically available. Using MyWorkDrive, you can bulk upload files so you don't have to do them one at a time. And you can also open the documents in co-edit mode. So if three of us on the call were in the map drive and we wanted to open this up in co-edit mode, we could do that. That would actually open up the web interface I showed you earlier. Couple other things, I think I mentioned that when you load the client, you can tell MyWorkDrive that you don't have local Office and you want all your Office documents to open up in Office 365 online. So that's a nice feature that you don't actually have to have local Office. The other thing about the map drive is it'll open up the associated application of this. So, you saw when I opened up Word, let's say I had, some custom application and you had the files. It would actually open that up based on the file extension. And I think that's it. I got it also supports the external file sharing, as you saw on the web client. And yeah, I had a call earlier today that says, hey, we've got 2 map drives. Can you support multiple map drives? Absolutely. So, and again, all of these clients, you can choose which ones you want to make available, and Scott will probably show a little bit of that. You can say, yeah, I just want the map drive. I don't want other people to use the web client or mobile. So you can, or all 3. So MyWorkDrive is not modular. You get everything. So you choose via the admin panel what you want to do. I think that is going to be it. Yes, we do have a mobile client. Just suffice it to say it works. You know what? It's going to take me 2 seconds to show it. Why don't I just do it? Here's the mobile client. Here's how it works. It respects the your single sign-on. There it is. You can choose thumbnails or detail. And here it is. It's a very nice, lightweight app that you can, here it is as an attachment, if you have the permissions to Word, to Outlook and all of that. And you can open it up, do some light editing. People like it. You can download it for offline usage if you need to do it later and put it back when you're done. And really you can save attachments that you get in an email back to it. And will interface with what you do have on that mobile device. So I did it real quick. That's mobile.
Thanks, Rick.
About it.
Yeah, and a couple things did get added. We should probably mention recently within the mobile client, we've got a upgraded viewer for viewing photos as well. That's a little easier to slide through if you're trying to quickly go through some photos. That's kind of nice. So we've been doing some small updates to that as well. And the also thing that we added, which we didn't mention yet, and Scott will probably just breeze over it on the server side, is device approval, right? We also can lock down whether or not you're allowing certain clients to connect. We have a device approval mechanism built into the server, so you can enable the map drive, but you have to approve the user's device before they're allowed to connect as well.
Perfect. So I think we'll have this.
Yeah, the next is to go over the server demo, and we'll just pass it over to Scott, who will show how the basic admin works. And again, we've got the full video that's an hour and a half long to really deep dive into that. We won't get into that today.
You're cutting into my comments about the fact that I'm going to do a quick overview, and we do have that full video on our support site in our server guide. The server guide is revised for version 7 with Entra ID, lots of links to additional new articles and things. So that's definitely a resource, as well as, well, it's already in my search list, so I'll just mention, we've got a dedicated article on getting started with version 7. So that's another good resource if you're deploying specifically version 7, whether you're brand new or whether you're an existing customer who wants to stand up a version 7 server. So lots of commentary about the things like that, some of the things that Dan talked about, the differences in storage, the different options that you need. And if you just hit like version 7 as a search on our search, you'll see there's things like storage options by product and product feature differences and things like that. So if you're an existing customer, there's a lot of resources out there for you. And as always, I think anyone who is an existing customer, I recognize lots of the names on this presentation. If you are an existing customer, reach out to us. We're happy to have one-on-one conversations with you. You can reach out to Kyle or support or Rick or whoever your typical contact is, and we'll be happy to go through your scenario, what's new, what's different, what makes best sense for you. So let's jump into version 7. Let me start with version 7, literally during the install. The key thing for you as you go through the install is really going to be this choice very early in the setup process of whether you're using Entra ID or Active Directory as your user database, right? Whether it's an on-prem Active Directory domain join machine or whether you want to use that cloud directory. This is a choice you make during setup. It's not a choice you can make once the server is installed. It's not a choice you can make migrating the server. And the reason for that is because the way we communicate with storage and the way we communicate with that directory is so much different that changing it really doesn't make sense. It's far easier to simply stand up a new machine than it is to try and migrate. Now, we make that migration as easy as possible, I promise you. Because the very first thing you're going to get, now existing customers are familiar with this the very first time you sign into MyWorkDrive, and I should back up and say, MyWorkDrive installs on a Windows server. Used to be, we always said a domain joined Windows server. That doesn't have to be the case anymore. Can still be domain joined. We fully support, I think Dan mentioned this and made it pretty clear, but I'll reiterate, we still support a traditional Active Directory model with Active Directory as your database and SMB shares on the NTFS with NTFS permissions. But even that environment now gets the ability to connect to Azure Storage with some caveats about your storage options. Anyway, this should look familiar to anyone who's been an existing customer. No real changes to this. And I think Rick's theme about how the user experience is fundamentally the same, whether your server is using Active Directory or Entra ID for identity and local storage or Azure Storage for storage. I would say very similar things about the admin experience. We've worked really hard to give you a very consistent admin experience. So customers who are Existing customers who are just simply upgrading to 7, not a lot has changed from a user experience from an administrative workflow standpoint. Now, the very first thing you get when you sign into a brand new server is our wizard. And I want to call this out just for a moment because I want to point out what the work that we've done to make this really easy to stand your server up. Of course, we want to prompt for how you're going to publish. That's because it's important for us to know how to connect to your server when we do this next step, which is all new, and that's this Entra ID tab, which you'll see if you choose Entra ID on that screen I showed you a moment ago. And that's the ability to automatically set up your connection to Entra and to create the apps that you need in order for your server to communicate with, well, in Azure, right? Azure Enterprise Apps, to be able to connect to your Entra storage. So there's a whole wizard to do this. You can do it all manually. If you saw on the previous screen the option to go manual and set this all up by hand and manually put in your app ID and create a key and all those things, but you don't have to. You can do it all through the wizard. So we really try hard to make that easy for you, similar to the way we do with Active Directory. So just know that that wizard is out there, and we've tried to make it easy because I know it's a problem, right? When I have to set up a new server and I have to do something new and it's something I've never done before, and there can be some challenge there, right, to get it all right. We're going to make it easy. Now I'm going to pop over to a server that's already set up to really get into the meat of the conversation. Again, similar workflow, similar sign in, similar click through. Let me start with storage, top of our menu. Of course, the menu is the same as it's always been. You'll see once my login goes through here. Never fails, you're on a demo and it's go slow on you. No, I'll go back to this server and tell you the menu is the same as it's always been. Of course, I can't click through to any of these things because I don't have my wizard set up yet. If you actually click, it will force you back to the wizard because we need that functionality. So the first thing I want to talk about here is shares. You'll notice a whole stack of shares, just as you're always familiar with. You still have the ability to do or not drive letters. Rick mentioned that briefly when he talked about, can I have multiple shares? Sure. The same functionality all exists. What's new is when you go into new, now storage type was new as of 6.4 because we used to support, we added SharePoint and OneDrive to go along with SMB, but now you've got SMB, which also includes local shares. You have local shares on the MyWorkDrive server itself, which we do by default as a demo option, just so you can see the product working without having to do a lot of work. But if you're actually running shares on the MyWorkDrive server, there's an easy option to present that. But also now you have Azure File Storage and Azure Blob Storage. And you can create these on the fly. You can pick this. I already have some, but if you needed to create one, you could click on Add Provider. And this will walk you through a process where you're going to make that connection to Azure that Dan talked about using a connection string, using an Entra ID auth, or if you're on an Azure VM and you've set up managed identity like Dan talked about with that managed identity, you're going to define the connection, whether it's a connection string or whether you're using it to a particular storage account, and then you're going to publish the share, right? Let me give this a name. Just call it demo for the time being. You're going to basically choose what in your storage account you're using, give it a drive letter if you so choose, turn public sharing on or off if you want. I'll talk about public sharing in a minute. I'm basically going to go through this menu in order. What's a little bit different in version 7 when using Azure storage or Entra ID storage, it's actually very similar to what OneDrive and SharePoint do, is these granular permissions aren't importing NTFS ACLs that are currently defined on storage because you don't have that with a connection string. You don't have that in Azure files. What you're doing essentially is looking up your groups from, in this case, Entra ID. So we've got a bunch of just testing accounts and such in our environment. And then a couple of special groups that we added to make this easy for you. These are simulated groups, Entra ID guests, which are B2B guest users you've invited to your tenant in Azure, or Entra ID members, which are members of your tenant, right? Manually created users or those managed identity roles, not guests. So essentially you're picking that. Now, what have I done here? Is that my permissioning? No. The underlying storage still controls who has access. So in this case, it's a connection string. The only defined tier of a connection string is everyone full access. So, your storage is still the arbiter of who has access, but you've given access to these users. Now, you might choose a more specific group. You might just choose a individual group from your directory. Or you might even choose an individual user. I don't think I can scroll and find a user, but here, we'll just type a user in here. A bunch of you guys know Jason. So now Jason, well, I actually picked 2 there. That's not what I intended. So I can give individual users permission, but again, it's still really controlled by what you define at the storage level. Now, connection string is a bad example, as I mentioned, because it's everyone. But if I go with an Entra ID model, then now it's dependent on the roles I've assigned that user in storage. So that user might have contributor, or might have only reader, right? So you have a bit of control there as far as that goes. Now, I'll talk about DLP in a minute when I get over to enterprise, but you can also make these shares read-only. So you've got a lot of controls. MyWorkDrive adds a lot of controls on top of just simply what you do with your Azure storage. And if it's not Azure storage, if it's local SMB, well, then we're back to having these shares. Now, there is an important difference with SMB when you're using Entra as your identity provider versus using Active Directory, where we've got NTFS ACLs. And that's when you're in, so the product we've always had, what so many of you on the call are familiar with, that Active Directory SMB using NTFS permissions, that still works exactly as it does if you install with Active Directory mode or you upgrade an existing server. So you'll still have that import button. You'll still see your list of permissions. But if you're in Entra ID mode, and I call it Entra ID mode, it's really using Entra ID as your identity provider for the users of the user database. We kind of use those 3 phrases interchangeable. You'll see all 3 of them in our documentation. They all mean the same thing. When you choose that, essentially, when you define your connection to this, you're naming the user that we're going to access under. So these permissions all still are true. I could still manually add Jason. I could say that Jason can't use the web client. Or I can turn public sharing on for this group. All those things are still true. But underneath, I'm going to pop over to integrations for just a second because I want to edit this integration for SMB storage. And we moved it in the last couple of builds, so I have muscle memory that's moving the wrong way. You're going to see I actually named the user that I access under. And we have an audit in here to make sure that it's valid. So if you don't get something typed in right, you got to check for that. So all of my access to, in the case of, we should use demo share because that's the one I had on screen. All of my access is in the context of Scott's permission. So Scott is read-only. Everyone that you define on that share will be read-only. If Scott has full control, everyone's going to have full control unless you apply some additional limitations to it like DLP. So I spent a long time talking about that. It's really sort of complicated. Follow up with us with questions you can ask in the Q&A in the Teams interface, or shoot us a message in support. We'll be happy to help you clarify that or talk through any of those things.
Yeah,
talk a lot about
the main
storage
thing on the SMB storage is that typically would be used by someone that maybe in some sort of migration phase, right? Where maybe they have some NAS storage, they still need to connect to it, but half their stuff maybe is in Azure, where they do have Azure Blob storage with Entra ID and hierarchical namespace permissioning, right? So there might be some certain specialty case, right? We're not really seeing it as the most common one where they're going to be using that kind of a methodology. They probably use one of the other storage types or Active Directory in that case with NTFS.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still a CIFS file share. It can still be a Windows file share or a NAS appliance or a SAN or anything of that nature. There's no changes to that side of it. So let's talk a little bit. Let me just kind of move down the list here. I don't want to use all my time talking about shares. I will talk about public sharing in a minute. It's on the list here. And I think Rick promised you that conversation too. Settings is really controls for options in the client, enabling and disabling options in the server, as well as settings for things like timeouts and log level, things of that nature. Consistent with our theme, not only do you have the ability to control features at the granular level on the share with these checkboxes, you also have the ability to wholesale turn things on and off. In this case, access to different storages, your Office Online editing, your clients, like all of those controls exist. And those are important because we want to make sure that you ultimately have that security, that ability to control, that ability to make changes. If you're provisioning things and want to do it and not make it live, you can set things up in the interface without actually turning them on and off and things so that users can't do that. And then a lot of other functionality in here within, like say, the client's web client, the operations when you have a click or a double click, or whether certain features are available, like that local web edit Rick showed you in the MapDrive client, restrictions for block and allow. Rick talked about file types. There's also sizes. Keep scrolling down here. So features like that exist in the settings section, a little bit of branding. Most of our branding is around enterprise. Enterprise containing in the Entra ID model, the ability to turn on or off that data leak protection that Rick showed you, and also all of the branding tools. Now, if you're still using Active Directory mode, you would also have SAML SSO as a configuration here. SAML SSO is not needed when you're in Entra ID mode because you can natively log in with Microsoft. And if you're paired with another identity provider, you're using Okta or Ping Identity or OneLogin or someone like that, you'll set that up through Azure the same way you could now, right? So you can still use those other identity providers. It's just done through Azure. There's no need to do that labor in MyWorkDrive. Everything's out there. Same with your multi-factor, right? We don't include a separate option for Duo when you're in Entra ID mode because you would just simply configure that in Entra. I say Azure, use Azure and Entra, pretty synonymous at this point, but you would configure it there. You don't need to worry about it. Dan mentioned devices and said I might mention it, and indeed it is on my list of things to talk about. Device management, like he mentioned, allows you to enable or disable individual users' install clients. It doesn't apply to the web client. The web client is just wide open. Anyone can sign in. There's no restrictions there because we aren't using a browser plugin, right? We don't have a unique device ID for users signing in there. But on the MapDrive, on the mobile, you see those things here. I can choose to turn those on and off. Right now, it's just in auditing mode, so they're not enabled. So it's just simply recording who's logged in. This is essentially how you start the process of using device approval. Is you watch who's requested access and you enable or disable or don't enable, as the case were. And if things change, you can take those away. If Samantha separates from the organization, I can simply turn Samantha's access off here with a search. If I want to find all of Samantha's devices, something like that. Oh, and the other one was already turned off. Perfect. And of course, these are not on yet. So device approval, great tool for organizations that aren't using a conditional access policy with compliant devices or something of that manner where they're controlling who can get access. You can do that all through MyWorkDrive. And I should say all of these things, you can, with the exception of choosing your identity or your user database in the setup screen, you can change all these things at any time. So if you're not using devices now and you want to, go in here, choose who needs to be approved and turn it on. If you deploy it and you find that it's problematic because you haven't accounted for everyone necessarily, turn it off. Come back to it in a couple of weeks after you've collected more information. All of that is perfectly viable. Rick talked a lot about public sharing. Public sharing comes up a lot because it's a feature that gets asked about a lot. It's something we had a great deal of requests for prior to introducing it in 6.4. Now that it's available, we get a lot of requests about securing it, and all of that exists for you too. You get to choose. You saw in the shares whether or not it was available in a given share and whether or not it was available to given users or groups within that share. But you can also set the base requirements of what's allowed. How long is it allowed to be out there before it's expired? How long do you keep it before it expires so that the user can renew it? Do you require passwords? All that sort of things, down to what's been shared on your server. Do you need to get it again because someone needs help? Do you need to edit it? Do you just need to wholesale delete it? You have control over all of those things. So wonderful tool, great for access, really fills a need that a lot of customers requested, but also strong abilities to manage it so you don't have to worry about it, right? You don't want to introduce something that'll cause you concern along the way. You can cluster. So clustering, I really should just say that you can cluster the MyWorkDrive server unless you read the documentation and reach out to us because there's a lot that goes into that. But essentially what you need to know is you can cluster the configuration files so that you only have to maintain one server at a time. If the servers can communicate with one another, if they're on the same domain, if they can reach a common storage. If they're not, you can just cluster sessions and locks using a database, either SQL or PostgreSQL, so that you can do co-editing across nodes, right? So you can support, I'm connected to server 1 and I've opened a document in Office 365, and Dan's connected to server 3 and he's opened the same document. We can co-edit even though we're on different servers. So lots of options for clustering. If you think you want to deploy clustering, you think you need it, reach out to us. We'll be happy to help with that. Alerts, this isn't used very much anymore. It's still a cool feature, but I think it's really been replaced by a sub-feature of logs we'll talk about in a second. But this is the ability to get an email when events happen, right? More than a certain number of files is downloaded by a user in a given period. Maybe your threshold is 5, maybe your threshold is 10, right? You can change all these things. Downloading, modifying, deleting, all those sort of things, basically to watch for inappropriate behavior. And maybe it's automated behavior from a script or backup software or something. Maybe it's just user behavior. Now, again, I mentioned this has kind of been superseded because it's dependent on our log data, which Rick mentioned, all the activity of users is logged. And we have the ability to enable a syslog push out to your SIEM. So if you're using Elk or Splunk or Sugo or Logarithm or PRTG or whatever, push this data there, get your alerts, do your historical recording, all of that functionality in your syslog. You're not dependent individually on the logs that are in MyWorkDrive. But if you need them or you want them, they're all here. You can see user Ricardo has been extremely active on my storage, deleting files, moving files, creating files. You got a base level of search. These logs by default are retained for 30 days. Over on settings is an option to adjust that. If you need longer than that, make sure that you provide sufficient storage on the MyWorkDrive server, because these are files that are written to the MyWorkDrive server. Or ask us about where they are and we'll talk to you about storing them in cold storage and write a little script to move them off. 2 more, I promise. And then one thing that's not on the list, Health Dashboard. This is more so a tool for us at the support level, but it can be a cool tool if you want to pop in here if you're having any problems in your environment. This monitors not just the MyWorkDrive server itself, but also the environment it lives in, disk I/O, Office Online status, Windows service, things like that. It's a good way to just quickly check if there are any issues, if there's anything that's not running, or if you have, like in my case, this demo server that I'm running on has potentially slow performance at times, and you get a history of that. So, essentially something like this that's up and has been up all the time, but if there were outages, so if you're looking at, users reported they couldn't reach the server on a Tuesday night when no one from IT was working, you can go back and look and see, was there really an outage? Did my MyWorkDrive have a problem? And you probably have other tools, in your environment to know when servers and such or networks and such are offline. But this is just a double check that you can use. The last thing in the interface I want to talk about is integrations. Integrations is something we introduced 6.3 or 6.4, I can't remember when, and we've been slowly increasing the tools that we add as we add additional tools like our integration with Cloudflare to do the Cloud Web Connector and the reverse proxy, or these storage providers we've added now with Azure Blob and Azure File. And integrations, you don't have to go to integrations specifically. It's more a clearinghouse of everything that you've configured. If you notice when I was on shares and I went to add a share, it offered to, of course I had to pick one. I'm going to pick Azure Files. You see, I have the option to add a provider, which is essentially when I click that, it's going to open that integration panel. So, and it does the same thing with when you're editing your Office settings, right? Your Office Online, you get that modify connection. It opens up the integration panel. But this is a nice place if you need to review what's been set up without having to go, you don't want to go through the interface and find it. Or if you want to make changes, like I'm on OneDrive right now, I want to go ahead and configure SharePoint, so I can click in, modify settings, put my SharePoint information in, and then choose to enable it at a later time. So I can stage and plan my changes without having to, real-time cut or do everything after hours, so to speak. The last thing I want to talk about is publishing your MyWorkDrive server, and that's a little more important with Entra ID than it was with Active Directory, or it becomes more important earlier in the process, because when you go through that wizard, you saw me step into the wizard earlier, when you go through that wizard, the first prompt is, what's your server address? We have to have that because we need to know what to set on the app when it's configured in Azure as the appropriate reply URLs or connection URLs or endpoints that the app is going to accept connections from or redirect traffic to. So we need to do that publishing a little bit earlier in the process than we used to. But you still publish your server the same way. The MyWorkDrive software, all the web client and the endpoints are all on, are all standard websites. So you can publish them with a proxy or a reverse proxy. That could be our built-in Cloudflare, which is a reverse proxy using Cloud Web Connector, which is a reverse proxy using Cloudflare. It can be your own proxy. You can put it behind whatever tools you currently use in your environment. Of course, you'll probably have a load balancer if you're doing clustering or something of that nature. So all those things are still true. They all work exactly the same way. You still need to, essentially, your endpoint, you're going to have to do that to make it available to end users. Now, I say publish. Doesn't always have to be public. We have lots of customers, some of those customers Rick alluded to that we can't talk about, who only publish internally. Their networks are secure. They have no public access. Everything is done internally, or they're only securing when users are connected to select devices. Maybe they're connecting to an RDS or a VDI, or maybe they're using a VPN or a zero trust type environment. All that works. You can do all of that with MyWorkDrive. I'll leave you with one reminder before I pass back to Dan and Rick, and that's don't forget that, I think that was actually on this server that I had it up already, myworkdrive.com/support. I've done 20 minutes on the server. I could do hours. In fact, we did do on the server setup guide, there's a 90-minute video going in depth on all these things. So, jump in, use that as a tool, or of course, use the link on the homepage of the thing to reach out to us and say, get help. So with that, I'll pass it back to the rest of you.
Great, thanks, Scott. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the Q&A page. That was a lot of great information, and as you mentioned, we have a lot of that same information in our server admin guide, where we really get into the video of, we even bring up IIS admin and show you how to add a SSL certificate, because the bottom line is the MyWorkDrive server is a web server running on IIS, all Windows standard components, right? So if you know how to publish a website, you can publish MyWorkDrive. All right, I do see one question in here. Does web and mobile web support most browsers? Do you want to take that one, Scott?
Yeah, and Jason actually answered too. But the answer is yes. We test against all the common browsers: Firefox, Chrome, Chromium-based Edge, Safari. There are very few limitations. There are a handful of things where, like Firefox doesn't have some of the JavaScript controls to do some of the uploads, but we just simply limit. There's always an alternative, right? But like drag and drop works in Chrome. It doesn't work in Firefox, but we have upload buttons. There's one or two things that may not work in Safari, but by and large, yes. All the major browsers, including the mobile browsers, there's a mobile mini web. So if you're using Android or Chrome or Safari on Android or iOS, those all work fine. We test all those cases. You can do everything you need to from all of those.
Okay, well, there's also a follow-up on that about larger write workflows, remotely attempting to write and work on things on Excel, where they're doing larger calculations and doing R to even larger calculations. I assume we're talking, I think we test up to about, 50 meg Excel, and it really depends on the user's internet, the server's connectivity. That's why in a lot of our server guides we have very specific instructions. If you want to optimize the setup of it, you want to make sure that the MyWorkDrive server is as close as it can be to the storage. As we mentioned earlier, Azure storage with API is a lot faster than Azure storage or Azure files with SMB in our testing. But in a case like that, you may even want to use local storage. Some people just, depending on the size and the requirements they have, they might just attach a drive directly to the MyWorkDrive server and run it right off of that as a separate data drive. So in order to be able to optimize all of that.
The running joke we always make is that MyWorkDrive can't change physics. If you have a slow internet connection, if you have some of these latency problems like Dan's talking about, MyWorkDrive is not going to fix broken storage, but we might give you alternatives that make it a little bit easier for you and for your users to access things, right? Like not dropping VPN connections and things of that nature. But, you should generally expect that the user needs to be able to get to the file, needs to be able to open the file, and a lot of the limitations we see are around internet connections and traffic on the internet. I could tell you the number of times, Jason, I have been on a support case and found that the issue was something along the lines of everything becomes unstable in the afternoon, and come to find out, it's a user working from home and other members of the household come home and, from work or school, and they start doing their work or school projects, and they load the network, and all of a sudden there isn't enough bandwidth to complete to complete whatever they're trying to do. But MyWorkDrive is not a bandwidth intensive application, no more so than any other remote work solution would be. The web client passes virtually no data. It's a web client. It's giving the user a web view of what's available until they interact with a file by downloading it or uploading it or editing in local office. And the MapDrive clients are designed to be very lightweight. They're passing metadata. As Rick mentioned, we're not sync and share. We're not moving the file to the client or the end user until they choose to interact with it. So those views in, directory views and browsers and such in the clients are simply metadata until the user double clicks to open in their local app.
Okay, and it looks like we did get also a chat related to upgrading. That was one of the first questions we had when we sent out the new version. First of all, anyone who's on 6.4 with Active Directory, should you or can you upgrade to version 7? Absolutely you can. You will stay in Active Directory mode and you'll use SAML for a single sign-on just like you have in the past. We're continuing and will continue to iterate on all the changes that will apply. We're just providing another option with Entra ID. But as Scott mentioned during the call, we don't support using that as a migration path to go from Active Directory to native Entra ID without Active Directory at all. We find that it's just easier to bring over your settings to a new server and as a clean environment and bring it up that way, which is what we encourage anyway, especially when we got a new major version like that, right? We can certainly add additional license activations, just contact sales at MyWorkDrive, and they'll be happy to add whatever additional activations you might need to be able to test things out to make sure it's fully going to be ready for you when you cut over your users.
And that upgrade, when you go to version 7 from 6.4, even an Active Directory does get new functionality. It gets, it doesn't get all the methods to connect to Azure Storage, but it gets the ability to connect to Azure Storage. It gets the performance improvements that Dan mentioned with some of those direct writes to Azure if you also upgrade the client. So it is a worthwhile upgrade even if you're remaining in Active Directory mode. Version 7 is not just for customers who want to use Entra ID. It's for everybody.
Yeah, and just one final comment. Thank you for that. You mentioned that users were bogged down by VPN have praised MyWorkDrive, which is kind of what I alluded to earlier about the fact that we don't require VPN, right? And with all the ransomware going around, a lot of customers still have VPN where you're basically allowing that person onto your internal network and you may or may not have any control about what's happening on that remote device, whereas MyWorkDrive ends up being a zero trust solution because you're only opening that one port to the MyWorkDrive server and then proxying that across and only using that to be able to get to the final storage. And even that connection can be run through a WAF or any other security devices you want, and use two-factor authentication and device approval on top of that, right? So that's something that we've seen customers want, and we're really happy to be able to provide that. I don't see any other comments. I do want to bring up the server admin page and some of the link guides that we have on our video. We encourage you to go to that address. Just go to the myworkdrive.com/support. If you click on the server section, this is exactly the first thing that's going to come up. That's going to have the video in there. The storage access matrix, we're putting that on here because we find that that's an important decision point when you're planning out if you do want to use some Azure storage, which would be the better choice for you depending on what features and functionality that you want to use. You'll want to take a look at that, and we'd be happy to, of course, set up a call with you and help you kind of work through whatever those options might be. Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We made it to 9:59 with 1 minute to spare. It's been great to talk to you all, and we look forward to reaching out to you and working with you personally to be able to get your MyWorkDrive servers all up to version 7. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And support at myworkdrive.com if you got any questions that you didn't answer but come up with later. Thank you.